Hi, everybody. You're joining me here on my front porch, second floor balcony over Broadway in South Portland. You're going to notice there's some traffic, sometimes kind of loud, big trucks and things once in a while, sometimes just a little sports car like this one coming through. But we're going to do our best. We'll make do, right? So we're done with the textbook. We're all done covering chapters and sections and this and that. What we're doing now is a project on Columbus. So I want to go over the directions for you of this Columbus stuff. You'll notice that there's links underneath this video on my webpage that'll tell you what the directions are for certain little parts of the project. Eventually, what we're going to do is there's like 47 of you that all have me for world history. So we're going to have two teams. There's going to be a Columbus is guilty team, and there's going to be a Columbus is innocent team. And you're all going to send me a message at some point, probably about a week from now, telling me, based on the reading that you've done, whether you think Columbus is innocent or guilty of what we call crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity is a very specific something. And I want to go over, that's like the big thing I want to go over in this video, really. What is the definition of crimes against humanity? So there is a document in international law called the Rome Statute, Article 7, Section 1, that literally defines what is a crime against the human race. So what I'm going to do now is explain. I'm going to go over it with you. You'll also see it written. I will send you a photograph of it. But I want to tell you and talk about it too. So crimes against humanity, according to the Rome Statute, means any of the 1 through 11 acts that are underneath the description, when they're committed in a widespread manner, a systematic way, or directed against civilians. Okay? So widespread, what does that mean? Well, if I were to go ahead and shoot somebody walking on Broadway here, that's a crime, right? If they die, that's murder. But is it widespread? Right? I did it once. And so therefore, it's a crime. It's murder. But it's not a crime against the whole human race. It's not a crime that you can be put on trial for in the international court. Okay? So there's a difference there. A crime against humanity has to be either widespread, done in a big way, either to hundreds of people or thousands of people, or maybe done multiple times at different times or in different places. That would be widespread, right? So, widespread or systematic. Systematic, well, the root word there is system. And a system requires a plan, right? So something is systematic if it's part of an organized long-term plan. So if it's one of these 11 crimes that's part of a system, a plan that's going to be carried out on a bigger scale, boom, it can be a crime against humanity. Or against a civilian population. This is important because we murder each other in war, don't we? Like, people shoot each other with guns or blow each other up with bombs, stab each other with bayonets or knives. And that's in wartime. And if you're doing it to an enemy soldier, called a combatant, then that's just war, okay? It's not a crime against the human race. A crime against humanity is still what we're talking about here. So it has to be one of those three things. Widespread, part of a system or a plan, or just against civilians, not in wartime, or if it is in wartime, not against soldiers, but just civilians. So these 11 things count if they meet one of those three. Murder. If it's widespread, if it's part of an organized system, like a government system, against civilians, then it can be a crime against humanity. Extermination, basically like murder of a larger group of people, specifically targeted for some reason, that group. Enslavement, if you, as part of a widespread or an organized, well-planned slavery thing, take a bunch of civilians and turn them into slaves, then that can be a crime against humanity. Deportation, or the forcible transfer of people from one place to another. Remember the Romans. The Romans were famous for taking the Jews when the Jews would rebel and say, no, we only have one God. We're not going to worship the Roman gods. Remember, the Romans would scatter them. They'd kick them out of their homeland and send them around. We in the United States did that too with Native Americans, constantly, all over the place, all the time, forcing them off the land that they thought they owned, and instead booting them out west. Sorry about that. Sending the Native Americans to reservations and things like that. Yeah. So, deporting, kicking people out, or forcibly transferring their homeland. 5. Imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of the fundamental rules of international law. This is something that the British did 100 years ago. They were in South Africa, and they were fighting against a group of Dutch people who had moved there to be farmers. They were called the Boers. And the Boers were fighting back the same way the Americans did in the American Revolution, like taking pot shots at British soldiers and being an irregular guerrilla warfare type of thing. And the British burned everybody's homes all over South Africa and forced all of the Dutch people to come and live in camps where they were contained in barbed wire and they couldn't leave. Therefore, they couldn't help the rebel Boers. The British called these places concentration camps, and the Germans used concentration camps later in World War II. Unfortunately, sadly, in American history, we did too. We took Japanese Americans, and on the West Coast, like in California, Oregon, Washington State, we forced Japanese Americans, even if they were born here, if they were part Japanese, they were taken from their homes. Their homes were usually just sold by the government, and these people were kept in camps where they were guarded because they might be spies in the war against the United States military. They weren't, but that's what now we would call a crime against humanity. Imprisoning or depriving people of their physical liberty in violation of international law, if it's widespread, done against civilians, part of an organized government plan. Number 6. Torture. Torture. For example, I think in class we probably talked about the Spanish Inquisition, and we talked about the torture methods that were used by the Spanish Inquisition, like the Iron Maiden, where you had to stand up in a metal coffin with spikes on the inside, and if you went too far in any direction, the spikes would pierce you. Or you might be put down on the rack, and they would stretch you out on the rack until your joints popped out. You might have your hands tied behind your back, and then you'd be pulled up off the ground by your wrists behind you until your shoulders popped out of joint as you dangled in the air, suspended entirely backwards by your wrists. So torture, these kind of things, if they're done in a widespread way, part of a government plan, or against a civilian population. Number 7, rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence. This is a really horrifying thing to try to talk about, but rape. Sexual slavery. This is something that the Japanese did during World War II when they conquered China. Um, they would take Chinese girls and force them out of their own homes to live together in Japanese-run houses of prostitution. And Japanese soldiers, when they had time off, would go to these places and pay a very small amount of money and use these Chinese women and Chinese girls because their country had been conquered by Japan. Really awful. Forced pregnancy. This is something that different civilizations have done before if they wanted the local people that they just conquered to not think about trying to be independent. The men who are the conquerors will, and this is horrible, will get the native women pregnant intentionally so that the babies are half conqueror and half colonist. And therefore, the next generation won't be quite so independent-minded. And another one to talk about is enforced sterilization. So if you've conquered a new territory and you want to make sure that the guys who owned that land before you got there don't have another generation of rebels afterwards, you might take away physically their ability to have children. You might sterilize them by force. Number 8. Remember, this is all if it's done widespread. A system or an organized plan and against civilians. Number 8. Persecuting and punishing people based on their politics, on their race, on their nationality, on their ethnicity, their culture, their religion, their gender. All of these things are protected in paragraph 3 of Article 7 in the Rome Statute. And if you intentionally sort people out and punish them or jail them based purely on their politics, their race, their nationality, their ethnic group, their cultural group, their religion, or their gender, then this is a crime against humanity. Number 9, enforced disappearance. This is a weird one, but it's really horrifying. And here's the deal. Back in the 1950s and the 1960s, there were a lot of dictators in South America, like Argentina and Chile. And one of the worst of the dictators was the leader of Chile. In public, if you criticized him, like if you were out on the street having a conversation with a friend, and a secret policeman was there and heard you criticize the leader or criticize the government, then you would disappear in the middle of the night. The police would show up, soldiers would show up at your house, they would break in, they would kidnap you, and take you to a military base or to the police station. And you'd be rounded up and tortured for days or weeks. And then, eventually, once they rounded up enough people to make it worthwhile, the government would force you all onto an airplane, a bomber, a big aircraft with 30, 40, 50, 60 seats on a bench. And they would fly you 30,000 feet over the ocean. They'd go out 100 miles off the shore. And they would open up the door and shove you out. Now, falling from a height of 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet, basically the surface of the ocean is the same thing as concrete. So when you hit, none of your body is really going to survive in a large enough piece to identify you, ever. And the government isn't going to keep records just in case they ever lose power and they get punished for the people that they've murdered. So that's why the language here is the enforced disappearance of people. Because there's no body to prove that you were murdered anymore. You've been pulverized, vaporized when you hit the ocean surface. So the enforced disappearance of people, that is a crime against humanity because the assumption very much is that the government murdered you. It's just nobody could ever prove it anymore. The crime of apartheid. Apartheid is the same thing as the Jim Crow laws. In the southern states in the U.S., what we had in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, basically keeping people of different races, of different ethnic groups, of different cultures, keeping them from living in the same place, from marrying each other, keeping them from having the same jobs, keeping them from the same stores in public. Or if they are at the same store, then they have to eat in different locations in the store, where one location is very obviously not as good as the other. Separating people in schools. Having a school for people of color and a school of people of the dominant group in that country. Apartheid is a specific word that's Dutch, and it actually refers to the Boers. Because back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, all the way until the 1980s in South Africa, the Boer Dutch white people ran the country. And they kept Africans, we won't say African Americans because literally they weren't American, they were pure African. They kept Africans, people of color, from being able to live in neighborhoods with the white Boer rulers. From working in the same jobs, from being in the same restaurant, from being in the same neighborhoods. Like, literally, they would have slums, and they would have palaces. And if you were a white South African, a Boer, you were in one of those palaces. You had the right to run for political office, where if you're black African, you do not have the right to run for political office. If you've ever heard of Nelson Mandela or Stephen Biko, these were both heroes. Oh, caravan. These were both heroes of the South African movement to liberate black Africans in South Africa. I don't know if any of you ever watched The Daily Show or if you know who Trevor Noah is, but Trevor Noah talks about the fact that when he was growing up, he was born to a black African woman and a white South African guy. So his dad could never publicly admit to being his dad. When they were out in public, they'd have to walk on opposite sides of the street because his dad would legally get in trouble if it was admitted during apartheid that he was this black African kid's dad. So Trevor Noah, living, walking example of apartheid and the unfairness of apartheid towards these people. So 11, number 11 on the list, the last one, other inhumane acts of a similar character intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or mental or physical health. So something that's really similar to any of those other ones, maybe not quite perfectly described in them. Now, there's a bunch of documents that you're going to get that all relate to this. And the documents that are in a link that I already have on this page, all those documents are primary documents. If you'll recall, primary documents means that they are eyewitness accounts, that they are from the people that we're studying, that they literally are of that time period. So you'll get primary documents there. There are a few secondary documents that I'm going to share with you. And I'll take photographs of these so you can read them at home. They are not as powerful. They are not as effective in trying to win the debate about whether Columbus was guilty of one of those crimes against humanity or innocent, based on the fact that we just can't prove it. Or can we? It depends on you. It depends on how good a job you do debating. It's not easy. Neither side is going to have it easy. Neither side is allowed to win just because they stand there and the other side isn't good enough. Both sides will have to work hard and try hard. This is a test grade in third and fourth quarter, and it also counts as your final exam. So this is big. If you blow the work off on this project, I have to warn you, you will have to spend an extra week of school, because school is over like on the 11th, I think, for everybody, except those people who need to do extra work to boost a grade in a class. And I'm telling you now, if you slough off on this and you don't do the work, and you leave your teammates in a position where you compromise the strength of the team, then I will have you do it again. So just an absolute clear warning for you. Do your best the first time around, and you will sail out of my class without having to worry on June 11th. If you don't, then you've got an extra week just to do the work for my class. So the first of the non-primary documents is a map. And you're going to see this map. I'm going to take a better photograph of it and share it with you. It's a map of Columbus's multiple trips to the New World. And it's got the years. The years are going to be pretty important. If you want to try to prove that Columbus was guilty of something specifically, then you pretty much have to prove that he was literally there in the Caribbean when you say the thing happened. Another document that you've got is a brief introduction to Columbian history. Columbian meaning Christopher Columbus and his crew. And then there is a timeline. The timeline goes on for several pages. You'll need to take a look at the timeline, understand it. You'll want to pull out specific evidence if you think he's guilty, or specific evidence if you think Columbus is innocent, and use that evidence to try to help you prove your point. And then the primary sources roll in. The first of the primary sources is a letter from Columbus to his bosses, the King and Queen of Spain. Big truck coming through. I'm going to be quiet for a minute. So it's a letter from Columbus to his bosses, the King and Queen of Spain, the people who sent him to go exploring. The next source is a letter from the King and Queen of Spain back to Columbus. The next one is a long one. It's Columbus's diary. And you're going to have to read parts of Columbus's diary. Other people on the team are going to read other parts. But I need you guys to all do your job, do your part, and make a decision for yourself on whether you think he's guilty or innocent. The next source is a letter from Christopher Columbus to a friend of his, the treasurer of the King and Queen of Spain, explaining to them what he's found. And then the last thing, source H, is a brief account by a guy who wasn't actually really there when Columbus was there, but he went there later. And this last thing explains how terrible the Spanish were to the Native Americans. That's what you would try to prove in Crimes Against Humanity. Your job is to prove that Columbus did it. Now, there's one last big thing. The original explanation of what's a crime against humanity is, remember I said it has to be widespread, it has to be part of a system or a plan, or it has to be against civilians. Well, there's one last bit of that sentence here, with the leader's knowledge. Okay, so if you want to accuse Columbus of this, then you have to prove that he knew it was happening, and that he either ordered it to happen, or he never punished anybody when he found out they did something horrible. So, that's your job. Read some of these documents. Make up your own mind. Was Columbus guilty or was Columbus innocent? And then you're going to develop your arguments as a team. Half of my freshmen, so basically a team of about 24 of you, will say he's innocent, and 24 of you will be put on a team saying he's guilty. And then you will divide up the parts on each team, your own tiny little part, what you're responsible for. So, I've had enough traffic for one night. I think you probably have for one morning. So, thanks very much. You're going to see photos of some of the documents that aren't already linked for you. But this is it. This is what we're doing from here on out. This is the big push. Congratulations on making it to May. Congratulations on the last month of school. This is it. You're there. Keep pushing.